One issue we see business owners struggle with is profit margin. We get asked the question, what is a good profit margin for my product? In today's video, we're going to go over the difference between gross margin and profit margin, how to determine a proper gross margin for your products, and common pitfalls to look out for. Stay tuned. This video is really going to help you. We have been fortunate to work with a lot of businesses, both large and small. One question that's always bound to come up is, what is a good profit margin for my product? First, let's get some definitions out of the way. Gross margin. Gross margin is sales minus cost of goods sold equals gross margin. Profit margin. Profit margin is your gross margin less your general and administrative expenses equals your profit margin. Now, these terms get used interchangeably and you'll see it a lot, but they're actually two distinct areas within your financial statements. So it's important that we get those terms out of the way first. Remember, gross margin, sales minus cost of goods sold equals gross margin. Profit margin is your gross margin minus your general and administrative expenses equals your profit margin. Now that we have those distinctions clarified, let's go down and determine what a proper gross margin is for your product and what the minimum amount should be.
Now recall from our video that we did on break even that there is a high-level method that you can do to determine what the appropriate gross margin percent needs to be at a minimum to be able to break even. And that method is to go through general administrative expenses as a percent of sales. That calculation will help you determine what your gross margin needs to be at a minimum. And once you've been able to determine that percentage, you want to, at least for 3 months, preferably more, but for at least 3 months, to determine what the average is for general administrative expenses as a percent of sales. From there, you're going to use that percent to determine what the minimum gross margin needs to be for each of your products. Now, as you can see on your screen, we've got the 3 months, month 1, 2, and 3, and each one of these months is showing either net income or a net loss. So, just so that we can prove this for everybody on the video, we're going to override the cost of goods sold to make the gross margin equal the operating expenses, and so that then you can see that this formula actually does work in determining what the break even is. So if we override the amount in month number 1 to 1278853, and as you can see, the net income is now 0, so theoretically month 1 we broke even. And in this example, you can see that the gross margin is equal to the margin of general administrative expenses to sales. So let's go ahead and do month 2 and 3. So month 2, cost of goods sold needs to be 1036547, and in month 3 it should be 1092486. So in each of these situations we went and overrode, so we made net income equal 0. And when you look at each of these gross margins for month 1, 2, and 3, each of those percentages equals the percent of general administrative expenses to sales for month 1, 2, and 3. And from there, we know that that formula does work. So that tells us at a minimum, our gross margin needs to be at least 10.5, 11.1, or 9.5 for those months. Again, you want to take an average because you will have fluctuations in month to month. So for the sake of our current video, we're just going to take the average of the 3 months, and as we look through the average of the general administrative expenses to sales, the average is 10.4%. So now we know what our minimum gross margin needs to be. From there, we're going to go ahead and take this to back into what our profit margin should be for each product.
Now use the general administrative expenses as a percent of sales to calculate your minimum gross margin for your products. Now you can go lower, however there should be extenuating circumstances for you to be lower than that minimum. such as the product's going to a very profitable client, it's a loss leader, or the product was grandfathered in. Whatever the reason, there must be some sort of documentation indicating as to why you want to sell this product below that gross margin minimum. Now, let's calculate the profit margin for your product. We know what the minimum gross margin is, so now we can piggyback off that to calculate the proper profit margin. The way you do that is you look at industry guidance. What does the industry show as the profit margin for the company as a whole, or even certain products? We as a firm use IBIS World, IBIS, but you can use any industry guidance you feel is appropriate.
So now let's go ahead and do a calculation on a product level so you can see how this works to be able to determine what the profit margin should be on your product. First, let's do a calculation on the gross margin, because we need to make sure that, one, before we even get into the profit margin side, we need to make sure, one, that we're selling the product for an appropriate gross margin percent, and two, to get to that minimum gross margin percent, we need to make sure that the sales price can get to that level, because sometimes we know what the percent is, but the market just won't allow us to have that. So in the first part of this example, we're just doing the gross margin, and as you can see here, we've got materials, labor, and overhead. Now these are items you should know for every product. This is important because this is how you're going to ultimately back into not only the gross margin for your product, but the profit margin for your product. So here we've got material of $500, labor of $35, and overhead of $25. This comes out to $560 for just product number one. So based off of that, we're able to back into what our minimum sales price needs to be for us to theoretically break even on this product based on a G&A as a percent of sales. So in here, we can do a calculation of taking the cost of goods sold, this amount of $560, and divide it by 1 minus the gross margin of 10%, which obviously is going to equal 90%. So you take the cost of goods sold divided by 90%, and that's how we get into the $622.22. So from here, we know this is the sales price we have to have for this product to break even on it. So that puts us at the 10%, which is what we had on the G&A as a percent of sales. Also, side note, we actually, for this part of the example, rounded the G&A as a percent of sales to 10% even, just so that it makes it easier to be able to visually see how this flows through. So in here, we've got sales of $622.22 minus cost of goods sold of $560. That comes to our gross margin of $62.22. As we mentioned, G&A as a percent of sales is 10%. So then we go ahead and calculate the $62. Now, theoretically, we're breaking even on this product. So now, for our example, we're going to assume that the respective gross margin percent, the sales price, the market can handle that. So now we're going to go and we're going to look up the industry guidance. And like I said, our firm uses IBIS World, but you can use any industry guidance you want. And theoretically, let's say that's for our particular industry, in total, the profit margin is 15%. So we can go ahead and plug that into our formula and say, okay, we know what the cost of goods sold is, because that hasn't changed. Our materials, labor, and overhead still equal $560, and so we can back into what the sales price needs to be for us to be able to get to the 15%. So you look at this, and same formula, you take the cost of goods sold, the $560, and divide it by 1 minus the profit margin, which is 15%, and you come up with $746.67. That then creates a profit margin of 25% for that product, and then you still have G&A as a percent of sales, because you look now, our G&A is $74 versus the previous example is $62, because we're maintaining that G&A as a percent of sales. So this comes down to our net income of $112 for this product, or a profit margin of 15%. Now this is all mathematical. The important part is we need to determine, can the market handle this? You know, like I said, profit margin for some of the products may be even higher. You may be able to sell it even for a larger dollar amount, which is great, and some may be lower. That profit margin you see on the industries is always an average. So when you do this on your products, you need to make sure that, you know, yes, I did a calculation, and for product one is $746. However, if you know your competition sells it for $700 and everyone else sells it for $700, you're probably not going to get the $746. So that's important to note when you're doing this is, yes, you put in the industry guidance, and if you can get more, then great, you're doing really well. But a lot of times you may come up and say, I can't get 15%. I can only get, let's say, 13%. So, you know, we'll just put in 13% in here. And now our sales price goes down to $722, which maybe that is what you could sell it for. So that's what you want to look at when you're looking at your profit margin is, can you meet that? You know, can the market either nationally or locally support that price point? And conversely, if you're doing this and there's no way you could get that profit margin, you either, one, need to look at your materials and labor to make sure that you're not overpaying for materials or you're overpaying for labor, or you're just being inefficient. Or two, maybe it's a product that you just don't want to go ahead and serve anymore. So, but again, this is how you're going to determine what your what your profit margin should be for your products.
Now, let's go over some weaknesses to this calculation method. One of the biggest weaknesses is you need to make sure that the costs that are in your cost of goods sold area and in your general administrative expense area are correct. You need to go through and review that they're not costs that are sitting in cost of goods sold that really are G&A or vice versa. So you need to make sure both those categories are correct. And recall, on cost of goods sold, you have materials, labor, and overhead. So it's very easy to put something in one of those categories that really should be a G&A cost. So let's go ahead and look at an example of what could happen if you have the cost in the wrong category.
So let's real quick show what can happen if you misclassify a amount in your cost of goods sold and your general administrative expenses. So here in this example, we've got a very simplistic sales of 10,000, cost of goods sold of 8,500. We got a gross margin of 1,500, G&A of 1,500. So we're breaking even. So net income is 0. We're breaking even. In this example, we're saying our G&A as a percent of sales is 15%. Let's say we've gone through and analyzed all of our products and we have some at 16%, 17%. So we're good with that. You know, it's above the break-even percent. So, you know, we're happy with that. Now, let's say at a high level, we determine that there's $500 in costs that were in cost of goods sold, but they really were G&A costs. You know, let's assume maybe it was rental on the admin building or some sort of insurance, something like that, that we determined really shouldn't have been in cost of goods sold, should have been in general administrative expenses. So if we remove $500 from there, watch what happens. So now our net income's still the same. We just did a classification from cost of goods sold to general administrative expenses. But now our percent of G&A to sales is now 20%. So if we did an analysis of our products and said our minimum gross margin needs to be 15% and we have some that are 17, 18, 19%, we may be thinking, yeah, we're at a good place with those. In reality, we're not. We're actually underwater on those ones because our G&A as a percent of sales is 20%. So that's why it's important to make sure that you go through each of your costs and make sure that they're in the right category, whether it's cost of goods sold, you know, within there you've got material, which that one should be fairly accurate, labor and overhead. You know, make sure the costs that are going there, and again, this is at the high level, this is at the income statement level, so you need to make sure everything is classified appropriately, and you periodically need to do a review to make sure that there isn't some cost that came in the current month that got allocated incorrectly. So you always want to be looking at that, and again, this is important to make sure that you have the correct classifications.
Okay, so let's summarize what we just went through. So first step you want to do is determine the minimum gross margin for your products. Use the G&A as a percent of sales method. Second, determine that what the profit margin is for your industry, and then use that to back into each one of your products. And third, verify you have properly segregated the costs between the cost of goods sold area and the general and administrative expense area. If you like what you heard, please hit the subscribe button. We'll be releasing more videos here in the weeks and months to come. If there's specific topics you would like us to cover, please put those in the comments area, and we'll work towards putting out videos in the weeks and months to come related to those topics. And again, thank you for watching.